Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our next PTRC Fireside Chat. Just a quick introduction to PTRC. We are a training company based in the UK, which specializes in the training of transport planners, engineers, designers, and placemakers. We are also part of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, which is the membership organization for professionals leading the movement of goods and people. Since April, we've had 6 of these fireside discussions. They've all led to some great conversations, and I'm really looking forward to some of those subjects coming up today. We have a fantastic lineup, as you can see, and I'm looking forward to the debate between these two groups. I'll hand it over to Ed now, who'll be the chair for the remainder of the day, and I look forward to seeing the discussion.
Okay, thanks very much, Brogan. Welcome, everyone, particularly those of you who are watching live, particularly those of you who are watching from abroad. It's great to see such a wide selection of people coming in to see these fireside chats. And throughout the discussion today, if you want to post any questions or comments, please feel free to post them into the chat box, and we'll try and incorporate them into our discussion later on. So in terms of introductions, my name is Ed Downer. I'm a principal transport planner at McDonald, and I'm also the immediate past chair of the CIHT Young Professionals Network. And today I'm taking the reins of one of these PTRC chats, and I'm very grateful to Glenn Lyons for offering me the opportunity to chair this event, and also getting some of our panelists on board to speak to you all today. So today's session is a panel discussion across 2 generations of transport professionals, reflecting on how key challenges facing the industry have changed. Now, we've talked a lot around some of these challenges in previous fireside chats for those of you that have dialed into the others. Things like public transport, freight, walking, cycling, the impact of COVID-19. But the focus today really is on the value that young professionals or emerging career professionals can offer in tackling these challenges. And just from my own sort of personal perspective, I've been trying to amplify the views of emerging career professionals for over 10 years now, long enough to cease being a young professional myself in the eyes of some people. I came into the industry in 2007, and at the time, it wasn't a really comfortable place to be as an emerging career professional. You went to seminars and the speakers were predominantly white, male, over 40. It wasn't really a good environment to try and make your own views known. The recession hit young professionals hard in 2008. And there was kind of a confidence perception, I suppose, where there was a belief that, my views don't matter compared to all these learned people that exist across the industry. But if there's one thing that my involvement with emerging career professionals has taught me, is that there's really a tremendous untapped energy out there. And, we're all coming into the industry as a highly tech literate generation. We're much more aware of the world that's around us because it's being pumped into our smartphones minute by minute every single day. And we have access to the transport debates at our fingertips, in much more of an immediate way than has ever been experienced previously. And this is something, an energy that I'm hoping to capture through a new initiative that we're launching called the Future Transport Visions Network, or FTVG. We'll be talking more about that in a little while. What I'm hoping this event can illustrate is how this energy can be harnessed in order to drive key transport debates forward. Now, getting young professionals involved in these debates is nothing new. And the reason for offering this retrospective is that this year marks 20 years since the foundation of another initiative known as the Transport Visions Network, which was a group of transport professionals across the professional and academic world who came together to amplify the views of young people into the debate concerning the future of transport and its role in society at the beginning of the 21st century. And between 2000 and 2003, the group published 8 papers outlining the main findings of the initiative. And some of the members that formed that network have now gone on into highly influential roles in the transport industry today. Lots of them have titles like professor, doctor, director, heads of, CEOs, and 3 of whom we're lucky to have on board with us at this session today. Now, I think we can all agree that things have changed since the year 2000. The best-selling phone at the time was the Nokia 3310, for those of you that remember that. And the top-selling single of 2000 was Bob the Builder, and he's nowhere to be seen now. So kind of reflecting on how much things have changed in wider society, what we're trying to unpick today is how pertinent the findings of the Transport Visions Network are in 2020. And do they resonate with the next generation of emerging career professionals? So again, to gauge that level of resonation, we were lucky to have 3 emerging career professionals with us today who have offered to give their thoughts on what issues they'd want to tackle if they were offered the chance today. And I'll be inviting all 6 of our panelists to introduce themselves in a short while. So as well as being 20 years since the foundations of the Transport Visions Network, today also marks the launch of its successor organisation, the Future Transport Visions Group, which is funded by the Reece Jeffreys Road Fund, who again featured on one of our previous fireside chats. And we're actively seeking participants in this new research initiative from today's new generation of transport professionals. We see it as your chance to contribute to the transport debate, tackle some critical issues, and make your views known in collaboration with others from across the industry. And hopefully what we'll get through in the course of the session today is a discussion as to whether we're still grappling with the same issues as the year 2000, or whether the emphasis of 2020's young transport professionals has now shifted, particularly in the wake of COVID-19 and the climate emergency. And are these the same areas that our Transport Visions Network members would want to examine again, given the chance? So I'm hoping this discussion will stimulate some interesting observations and perhaps inspire some new ideas for people to submit to the Future Transport Visions Group. And you can complete your expression of interest form for that online via www.ftvg.co.uk. So the way this session is going to run today is that I'll invite each of our 6 panelists to give a 5-minute opening statement on their view of the transport debate and the role of young transport professionals within that. And then we'll have between 30 to 45 minutes of discussion, which will hopefully lead on from that. And like I said, if you do want to add your own questions and comments to that discussion, please feel free to pop them in the chat box and we can see if we can add those to our own little agenda as well. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our panelists, starting with our original Transport Visions Network members, to give their opening statements, starting with Professor Greg Marston. Greg.
Hi, thanks, Ed, and thanks everyone for joining. Great to see everyone on the panel too. So I was part of the team at Southampton who put the network together, myself, Kieran Chatterjee, Glenn Lyons and Mark Beecroft. We entered an essay competition for the World Roads Association on future visions for transport. And that got us thinking about whether there were some other people out there motivated to think about that and save the world or something along those lines. Looking back, it was really important. It was a bit like Ed was saying, if someone had asked me to describe a meeting I went to early in my career, I would have said senior white males in suits, and speaking up and speaking out didn't feel so easy. I mean, I do feel the diversity industry has massively shifted since then. There's obviously still more to do, but it was a great environment to develop in, and the network members have become friends and colleagues, some of whose paths I cross frequently and some less so. But one of the great things I think about this new initiative is that it will help build a new fellowship, and that's really important as you go through your careers. The way the network worked was we would set up some themes with the Southampton team, and then we would invite the network to debate through email. Worth thinking that email was only just becoming mainstream at work. You were quite proud that you had an email address. There was some really, really poor connectivity, dial-up modems, all this sort of stuff. I think I used Pegasus in DOS format, if anyone can even understand what the hell I'm on about. People would respond to provocations in lunchtimes or evenings, and you'd sometimes come to a stream of like 50 emails that things had really kicked off. And it was good fun. We ran some physical events too and produced 8 quite lengthy but provoking and as Ed said, actually quite enduring reports, I think. I led the vehicles and infrastructure report, which I'll talk a bit more about. I'm only actually an author on the first 4. We didn't split up, the band didn't fall out. I just got a job working at the House of Commons where I had to write things on 2 pages of paper rather than 92 pages. I mean, I think at the time the network was very progressive. It was at the front of ideas, trying to push the wider role of transport in society. There's still so much more to be done on this. We still end up talking about modes and infrastructures more than we talk about people and the role of transport in society. As the COVID-19 response has shown us, just how connected we are to, even things like what's happening with city centres and pension funds and property markets, all these sorts of things that it went well beyond what we were talking about. Anyway, I had a look back at the vehicles and infrastructure report, having just criticised myself for talking too much about modes and infrastructures. The vehicles and infrastructure report was really good. So we were talking about micro scooters, segways, e-bikes, and other lightweight vehicle options. Narrow cars was one of my favourites, kind of 4-seater thin cars, so you could double the lane capacity. But actually, I can never get away from one of the more compelling arguments of the network and my time in Transport from Ali, who you'll hear from shortly on car sharing. The fastest way to double the efficiency of a car is just to have someone else in it rather than redesigning the vehicles and the infrastructure to try and make that possible. It's already possible today. We discussed hydrogen fuel cell buses, personal rapid transit, automated pods, drones, although drones wasn't a word at the time for a transport mode anyway. And in 2023, so we've still got 3 years left to do this, we had everyone paying a universal £2,000 mobility tax in return for ubiquitous high-frequency mobility as a service. Essentially, that's what it was. I mean, it was under a different name in the report, but that's what we had anticipated. I can't quite see that coming about myself. And we did some really interesting scenario thinking. So, I mean, some things were missing. Electrification wasn't there, for example, but I think a lot of our debate cycles round. And perhaps we need to kind of look back as well as looking forward and try and understand why things are difficult to change or have been. And I think fundamentally we're still grappling with the question of how to resolve the problems of car dependency whilst keeping the best parts of mobility and access opportunities that this has all afforded society. Our crystal ball was no better than anyone else's, even though I think the reports were really good and benefited from that diversity of insight. We anticipated the environmental agenda would be taken seriously. At the time, the target was for a commitment of a 20% cut in CO2 emissions. Instead of 20% cut, we wasted 20 years with climate inaction. And I think that, that is now going to be a very different defining agenda for the next 20 or 30 years. And the policy choices that really ought to follow with that are more radical than we were considering even. We missed the importance of some of the bigger, wider landscape changes: global financial crisis, austerity, growing wealth inequalities, loss of trust in experts, certainly in popular narratives within government, Brexit and the importance of new industrial narratives, the importance of transport as an industry, obviously COVID-19. Why would we predict any of those specifically? We couldn't, otherwise we wouldn't be working in transport. But I guess what I'm saying is that we grounded our work probably in a more stable policy worldview than I hope would be anticipated looking ahead now. So I'm going to stop blathering on there and pass on to Nicola with a final observation. It takes a long time to change an industry or a set of structures in society that have been dominated by big infrastructure and vehicles and land use changing very slowly. So it's really, really important to get your voices into the debate early in your career. And it's not just young professionals. I think we need to listen to society as a whole, because we've got some very difficult changes to be made to come around for the climate solutions that we need. And so actually we're going to need to bring everyone with us, but that definitely means having the voice of the upcoming generations loud and clear in what we do. So thanks, Ed.
Okay, thanks, Greg. And as Greg said, if we move on now to Nicola Kane.
Thanks, Ed. It's fantastic to be here today, although I'm slightly freaked out that it was 20 years ago that we did the work on the Transport Visions Network. And as Greg has said, a lot has changed, but so much hasn't changed, and so many of the debates are still the same. So I'm head of strategic planning, insight and innovation at Transport for Greater Manchester. So my job is all about thinking about the future, developing long-term strategies, and I've recently taken on the role of heading up our innovation team. So very much sort of testing new innovations in the real world and seeing how they might support our long-term strategic goals. And I joined TFGM 6 years ago after spending 15 years in transport consultancy. And I was a transport consultant in the first sort of couple of years of my career when we kicked off the Transport Visions Network activity. And I have to say it was hugely influential in my career, looking back on it actually, to have that opportunity so early on to meet all these different professionals from across the country, from the public, private sector, academia, who I never would have met otherwise, I don't think. And as Greg has said, many of us have sort of kept in contact over the years, it's sort of inside, outside of work, and that network has proven to be incredibly useful, important in my career, and sort of shaping my thinking about transport planning. So I was also involved in the vehicles and infrastructure group, but the one that I probably was most involved with was around society and lifestyles, where we were thinking about different visions of the future around different social, political, environmental, and economic driving forces. And I remember we had a sort of mock debate, I remember, between me and Kieran in one of those all-day workshops we held about putting forward a vision of a community-oriented society against a future vision of a more individual-oriented society. And it's really interesting looking back at those reports, and I agree with Greg that actually so much of them are still relevant today, and I think they're well worth a look for any young or older transport professional, actually, because there's a huge amount of valuable material in there. And actually, when you look at those two different visions of a society, actually, I think there's a real blend in terms of what's actually come to pass, and you can see elements of both, and elements that we probably hoped would have come about by now, which haven't. So I suppose on the positive side, much more support for families, for working parents. I think that probably we didn't have very much of that at all 20 years ago. I think more of a focus on quality of life and policy making. We've obviously still got a long way to go there, but that comes through as a much stronger theme, I think, around sort of place making. Certainly more home working, certainly in the last 6 months, but and obviously the pandemic has massively accelerated that. I think we probably had hoped that there would be more of that kind of coming about without a major crisis as a catalyst. And more sort of dense urban living. Again, that comes with pros and cons, but at the time, that was only really sort of starting to come about with people moving back into town and city centres. And on the flip side, around sort of a more individual society, we've definitely seen some of the things that we had in our vision there about sort of less, more inequality in health outcomes, move towards a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week economy, continued focus on personal mobility over shared mobility. So very much a sort of blend in terms of what's actually come to pass. But there's a lot in there that I think is still holds true in terms of some of the visions we thought we'd like to see in a future world. So as I said, I think taking part in that network activity has been, I look back on it, very fondly. I think it helped me to sort of open my eyes to a wider range of perspectives and different issues than I perhaps came across in my day-to-day working life. And it helped me to develop some of my sort of more analytical skills and debating skills as well. And I do remember those really long email debates that would go on over several days, and then you'd have a sort of period of silence, and then again you'd come back to a great flurry of emails. So just thinking about some of the topics that I suppose if I had the opportunity to do it all again, that I'd be interested in, and slightly selfishly, these are kind of linked to some of the challenges I face in my day-to-day life. So Ed was mentioning before we started about sort of how vision-led planning has become more embedded in the way we think about strategies, but I think actually turning that into reality is a real challenge. How do you actually operationalize that sort of vision-led approach? How do you keep a range of options open? How can you be much more flexible in how we deliver transport infrastructure and services to allow for different futures? I think there's still a lot more work to do to get into the real nitty-gritty of how you make that happen. And then, of course, how do we make that rapid transition to a net zero carbon transport system? And what would that actually look like in 20 years time if we've actually achieved that? What would that mean? So I'll finish there, Ed.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Nicola. Already seeing some interesting themes starting to emerge there, which I'm furiously writing down as I go. So the final member of our Transport Visions Network panel is Ali Clabburn.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks to the team for putting this together. Really excited to be here. I think a lot of what I'd say is very aligned with what Nicola and Greg have said already. But right now, I'd just say this is such an exciting time to be in transport. It's such an exciting time. It's such an important time. When I look back at the last 20 years, I'd say hands up, we failed. We had great visions. We had great talks, great discussions, real excitement. I say the Transport Visions Network. When I found them, I say I found my crowd. I've been in the transport world for a few years. Really struggled to find anyone with any vision or belief or ability to get up and make stuff happen. And I suddenly found a whole gang of people who really wanted to change the status quo and work together to come up with a better way of doing things. And looking back at those papers, it is remarkable how there are actually so few new ideas under the sun. The things we were discussing back there, we're still discussing now. Some of them have taken off, but many were brilliant things that are still yet coming. Seeing home working suddenly, literally in the last 6 months, suddenly kicking off, and we imagined back then it's going to kick off within the next few years, and it's taken all this time. But almost thanks to COVID, we've been forced to do it, and having done it, we've realised how good it is. It was a different time back then. The key things that have changed. I mean, tech. You talked about tech. Only 25% of the population had access to the internet, and only probably 30-40% had smartphones. So we were in a different place from a tech point of view, but transport moves very slowly, and the problems we faced back then are still very much problems with us today. Congestion is still a problem, exclusion is still a problem, access to affordable transport is a problem. And there's a danger that we're still doing many of the things in the same way we were back then, which is a challenge. When I joined the Transport Visions Network, I'd say 2 years was about long enough to realise that the transport industry was a hard one to crack, and I'm really thrilled that this has been kicked off again, because I'd say if it wasn't for that network at that time, I could have well given up on the whole idea of making lift sharing a thing. There were people around me who would challenge me, believe in me, encourage me. Still, we're fighting many of the same battles we were 20 years ago, but the network, I mean, I spent a few years working with Glenn on projects, more recently with Greg on the whole CO2 reduction stuff that we're doing. It's been a brilliant network to be part of, and I would highly encourage anyone with the opportunity to do something similar right now to jump at the opportunity, because it will be great for them and their careers. We're now all kind of entering what should be the prime time of our careers, where we're making a real difference. We've got to show real leadership, and to show real leadership, we've got to listen to all voices, particularly the young voices coming into the sector with their ideas and their beliefs. They don't come with the baggage that we've picked up over all this time. They come with clarity of thought, and they make some really sensible decisions. And often the newest recruits into lift share are the ones that we listen to the most, because they're the ones that are more in touch with where things are going. So looking back at the papers, I mean, they've been covered. I would encourage everyone to read back. I was slightly skeptical about reading back. I couldn't really believe they'd be that relevant, but I was amazed at how relevant They are, so I would encourage them. They are long, but they're really well put together. A bit academic for me, but well put together. So my vision looking forward, and what I'd like any group now to be looking at, it has to be the #1 priority, which is decarbonising the transport network. We've got to get to net zero by 2040. If we can get some people there by 2030, let's do it. We've got to think differently. We can't base it on historic models and the way we've done it in the past. We've got to look at what we want to achieve and make it happen from like outcome based. But also, I think us as a sector, we just don't do enough with data. We do data modeling, but we don't look at personal data. We don't look at the demand data of what people want to do. And in all of our experience through lift, share, and mobility ways, when we've looked at what individuals want to do and work with them rather than against them, we've managed to get some really quick behavior change stuff going on. So I would look at net zero future. I'd look at data-based. All decisions should be data-driven. And I'd say that we've got probably 80% of the solutions there right now to solve this, but we're just not adopting them quick enough. So let's not put all of our activity into new R&D. Let's put it into pilot projects, test and learn projects as fast as possible so that we can really start moving things forward. Because if we're going to get to net zero by 2040, that's a 5% reduction a year. At the moment, we haven't reduced 5% in the last 20 years. We've got to do that every year for the next 20 years. So we've got to start getting a shift on. And that's about all from me.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Ali. So now I'd like to, they've kind of thrown down the gauntlet there. I'd like to hand over now to our panel of emerging career professionals who will be speaking on behalf of the emerging org of the sector. And I'd like to start with Claire Linton.
Great, thanks very much, Ed. So I'm Claire Linton, I'm Policy and Research Advisor at the Urban Transport Group, which is the network of the 7 largest city region transport authorities. And there I do research across a whole range of transport policy areas and support our professional network with networking across different areas of policy on transport. And over the last 6 months, sort of my work's been focused on supporting transport authorities in managing the coronavirus crisis. And starting out, Ed asked us to think about what the key challenges are facing the industry today from my perspective as a young professional. And I very much pick up where Ali left off with decarbonising transport is kind of the biggest challenge facing our sector at the moment. You know, we have a national target to deliver net zero carbon emissions by 2050, but a lot of cities and regions have set earlier targets on this and now face the challenge of actually delivering this on the ground, and particularly in transport, which is, you know, historically been a difficult sector to decarbonise. And then coupled with the coronavirus crisis, which has really hit confidence in public transport, which we were already seeing declining patronage on bus and public transport use in general, and that's only been accelerated by the current crisis. So how we deal with these two parallel crises, which are kind of exacerbating one another, is really challenging. Although obviously we've had sort of great leaps in home working, and that has benefits too. So for me, those kind of the two biggest challenges facing the sector at the moment. And then sort of reflecting on how things have changed since the 2000s. When we think about decarbonising transport, I think, you know, we were obviously talking about this in the 2000s, but we've seen very little progress over that time. So the challenge gets harder every year that we don't deliver emission reductions. The curve of those reductions becomes steeper. So it kind of is accelerating as we go forward. And I think the other thing I was thinking about as we were talking and links into why we really need to hear from emerging professionals on this debate is the role of young people in the climate movement. I think that's really changed over the last 2 decades. I was involved in youth politics when I was a teenager in sort of the 2000s, but it was pretty niche then. It wasn't something that kind of a lot of people were into. And then sort of through my 20s at university, I did a lot of youth climate campaigning, but it's kind of the mainstream now. We hear it from all young people. It's become such a big issue for young people. From sort of children through to young professionals. And I think we need to take that energy and enthusiasm and urgency sort of into our professional roles as well, and really try and bring that into accelerating action on decarbonisation. And then I was trying to think about other things that have really changed since the 2000s, because I think a lot of what we've said is that a lot of what we're talking about is similar challenges, but one thing we haven't talked about so far is e-commerce. And I think that's been a real transformational change in how we get our goods. It's sort of the massive rise in online shopping I think over the last few years as well, the speed that we expect with deliveries, so we expect things the next day or the same day, and that has real implications for sort of the efficiency of those systems. And we've seen massive growth in van traffic in our cities, which has implications for emissions and congestion and safety. So I think thinking about how we get our goods and services in cities, I think freight is kind of often an afterthought in transport planning, but is really important and is actually quite tricky when we think about decarbonising as well. So I think we need to keep freight on the table and keep thinking about freight and goods and services, and when we're thinking about the challenges facing the transport sector. And then finally, I think Ed asked us to sort of think about what advice we would ask for from our Transport Vision Network colleagues. And I think for me, I wondered if you had any advice around both the benefits and challenges of working across disciplines and bringing together those different perspectives. And I think, it can lead to a really rich debate, but sometimes can create challenges in finding consensus. So I wondered if you had any reflections on that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Claire. We'll keep that question on hand for our TVN panel to respond to after this. So next on our Emerging Career Professionals panel, we've got Daniel Mccool. Daniel, over to you.
Thanks, Ed, and hi everyone. I'm Daniel Mccool, a senior transport planner at Arup, based in Cardiff. And I'm most interested in design of public transport systems and integration of emerging and shared mobility, as well as how sort of transport interventions can make happier, healthier, better places to live, really. So yeah, at 9 years experience, I guess I'm pushing the boundaries of young professionals, so I'll refer to myself as a younger professional perhaps. And yeah, I guess so. Yeah, Ed has asked us to think about the challenges. To me, it's been touched on before by Ali and Claire that we've got the challenge facing us now is very clear. We know we need to reduce carbon emissions and move towards net zero, and that should really frame everything that we do. That's our headline, that's our mission statement, and that's sort of that's where we need to get to. And to do so, there's obviously lots of hard work ahead. But yeah, as been touched on before, what a great time to be working in transport, and for young professionals especially. We've never had a better chance to influence change and have a sort of material impact and legacy really on the world around us. And to me, I think all other sort of challenges are secondary to that sort of main goal, but there are many of them. For example, we sort of call disruption brought about by emerging technology and autonomous vehicles, micromobility, all the rest of it. A transport challenge. Equally, we know we need to do better on land use planning and digital connectivity, working from home, etc. And many more that I'm sure we'll get to in the discussion around active travel, etc. But yeah, I'm just thinking whether maybe we need to sort of slightly change the narrative, and whether we should view these as enablers to achieving that main goal. If we the way is becoming more clear now, especially accelerated by the COVID pandemic. I think we can see that as a catalyst to make this change that we need to make, and the path is becoming sort of more clear as to what we need to do. So yeah, in recent months, many towns and cities have taken the opportunity to remove parking and close streets to traffic in favour of outdoor seating, bike lanes, places for people to spend time in and enjoy. And this sort of tactical urbanism has shown us how we can how quickly we can change our cities, and allowed us to reimagine what that change looks like in the longer term. And yeah, as Claire mentioned, equally sort of physical distance on public transport has forced us to think more about how public transport networks are planned and funded. Reform of bus and rail operations now seems inevitable given the sort of situation we find ourselves in. And I think we need better integration, innovation, and technology around those services and integrating different modes. And yeah, really need to focus on improving individual journeys and enabling accessibility across towns and cities, and you know, enabling growth in demand for those public transport services. And we've also realised, you know, we don't need to commute to the office 5 days a week, and perhaps we're more mobile now than ever before. And you know, to me, I think these two go hand in hand. You know, the towns and cities that make the right decisions around transport infrastructure and livable cities, etc. Those are the ones that are going to have the better quality of life, where people want to go to, where they want to live, and where they want to work remotely from. So I think there's going to be an increasing pressure on cities and local government to make the right decisions around that, improving livability and encouraging economic development. And you know, hopefully there's a bit of a virtuous circle there, where you know, we can reinvest the benefits of doing that. So in short, yeah, I think we should see COVID as a bit of a catalyst and an enabler, and yeah, hopefully some of the other challenges that we'll get to, addressing them will help us achieve our sort of end goal. But I guess, yeah, question is how we keep the momentum going, and yeah, I guess that's one for the network to consider. And then just, yeah, touching on sort of the advice that we sort of could get from from our sort of former peers, is not former peers, but I didn't want to say older generation there, but I'm gonna have to use it now. Is you know, yeah, we need to consider our ability, bit of a need for caution, really. How do we change the minds of those who depend on the status quo, I guess? And yeah, in flicking through the papers, I picked out one quote in particular. So it says, in a scenario of economies competing for growth, governments will use their powers to support industries that produce profits. So oil companies and the motor industry produce profits that in turn produce tax revenue. And in this context, support for more environmentally friendly but largely unproven and unprofitable industries, for example, renewable energy and non-motorized transport, will be slow in coming. And I think that really sort of summarizes the picture for me of the last sort of 20 years, perhaps, and perhaps there's a reason why that sort of change has been slow. So yeah, I guess, yeah, to what extent has a reliance on maintaining the status quo halted sort of progress, and how can we keep this sort of more recent momentum going? Yeah, and another question really around government's role. I think we need a sort of guiding mind to deliver all this change, and are they doing enough? And it's good to hear we've got some sort of experts in government, with experience in government as well. And yeah, I guess sort of thirdly, I'm just quite curious as to how quickly 20 years goes by in professional life. I think, you know, we've touched on the original papers. Many of the challenges are the same today. So yeah, I guess how quickly you find that going in, and yeah, yeah, that's it for me. Looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thanks, Dan. Some interesting questions in there. And finally, on our Emerging Career Professionals panel, I'd like to hand over to Laura Menendez-Gonzalez from WSP.
Thank you, Ed. So my name is Laura Menendez. I'm a senior engineer for WSP, working in local government in Shropshire. So my background is slightly different to the rest of the people in this panel, I believe. Not quite transport planning, but it has always been focused around infrastructure and maintenance, and how can that infrastructure be kept running. I'm also chair of the CIHT Young Professionals Group for West Midlands, and I've been supporting Ed getting the Future Transport Visions Network together and up and running. So on the challenges, I think one of the main things I was thinking is, has everything been invented already? Has everything that, for example, this the previous transport vision network looked at, is that it? Is a new bunch of young professionals going to come with new ideas, or are we just going to be recycling and looking into how we can implement them better, potentially? Something else that I think is a challenge is, again, as Claire mentioned before, the pandemic and how that has affected public transport. I guess it's a good thing that quite a few of my things have already been mentioned, because it aligns that sort of thought on how young professionals think so the transport industry is working. But looking into that, I live in quite a rural area, with a lot of older people. So are those older people going to lose faith in public transport? How are they going to then move? Again, a lot of them don't necessarily own their own cars. So how is that going to affect everything in terms of mobility in these rural environments? And how could it be implemented into the future? Are things going to look any different in 12 months? Is any of these or are any of these temporary measures that have been introduced in town centers, social distancing, social distancing in everything, is that going to carry on for a year, for 2 years, 10 years? Is it just going to be with us forever? And then something more on the practical side, it's very good to talk about how we have to reduce emissions, but how are practically our contractors going to reduce their emissions? How can we build and maintain a carbon neutral network when there is a lot of big machinery, there's a lot of materials production that is just not, the technology is not there yet. Thinking about how things have changed since the 2000s, I do think, and I have been around for a bit, for almost 7 years now, I do think that the industry has changed a bit. I do find that it's a bit easier to, if you have an opinion, to express it, and it is more welcomed, as it would have been a few years back, and well, definitely more than a few years back, based on some of the stories some people have mentioned before. But also it's around technology. Technology is much more readily available now. We have access to so much technology now, but is that too much? Are we just surrounded by so much data that we can't physically process it? And then just in terms of advice, I think some of the things that if I was going to be undertaking this, I'll think about is there such a thing as a too small of a project or too large of a project, where you put the line there? How can you find your balance? And then does the transport vision or the previous transport vision network think that has anything been groundbreaking enough or disruptive enough? I was sort of comparing it with how HS2 has been impacting now in these past few years, and now that the works are starting, and how that's going to disrupt, well, not disrupt, but how it's going to implement and bring that connectivity from London into the the rest of the country. Has anything like that been done, or has anything that has such a big impact been done? And if not, why not? Do we have to just sit and think about all the things that have been proposed and why they haven't really worked? And that's sort of me. I think it's a bit more negative, potentially, but there you go. Okay,
thanks, Laura. It's good to have diversity of opinion. It's good to have some challenges thrown in there, as well as boundless optimism. So what I'd like to do now is pivot to some of the questions that our emerging career professionals posted to our Transport Visions Network members, and just going back to what Claire said about the benefits and challenges of working across different disciplines. So I was wondering with that whether it might be useful to start with Ali on that one, and just see what the other panelists have to say about that.
Hi, yes, good question. It's been a bugbear of me for all of my career that we think in silos. We think in silos within the transport world and in silos across all departments. If it was up to me, I would scrap the DFT. And I would start a DFC, I'd start a Department for Connectivity, because that's basically what transport and mobility and connectivity is all about. I think the link between technology, the internet and transport needs to be much, much closer together. And I'd also combine that with DEFRA as well. I mean, the fact transport's basically been forgotten about in terms of carbon emissions for the last 20 years. And as a result, it's done nothing. We have not been held accountable to, and we haven't been set very clear targets. And the energy has gone into the energy sector and other areas where they had clear KPIs. So I think it is absolutely essential that we don't think about this in silos. People are at the heart of everything, and people don't fit into any silo at all. They fit into every single one. So I think what we need, rather than being in silos, is to have a very clear leadership, very clear metrics that we can base on. If there's one metric to focus in on in transport, it's probably, I don't know, CO2 emissions per person per vehicle kilometre travelled or something, and we should all be set the goal of reducing it. However, whether that's with transport, with technology, with home working, with policies, all sorts of things, but it can't be done in silo. We've been there for the last 20 years and we've got nowhere. Oh, you're muted.
Thanks for that, Ali, for pointing out that I was on mute as well as your comments earlier. Before I hand on to the other members of the panel, it's worth pointing out that for both the Transport Visions Network and the Future Transport Visions Group, we are encouraging cross-sector collaboration to the fullest extent. I think initially we're reaching out across the transport industry, but potentially the point that Ali's making here is that maybe we should be looking beyond the transport industry and bringing in, carbon experts, psychologists, engineers into the mix as well. I don't know whether either Nicola or Glenn had anything to add to that particular point about cross-disciplinary working.
Got a couple of contributions. And I think within the transport industry, I think we need to be much better about having an honest debate about infrastructure and demand. I look at for example, West Yorkshire carbon trajectory suggests we'll need 20% fewer vehicle miles, but we're still building the stuff that the money's available for at the moment. So we're just not we're not having that honest discussion about actually what future are we planning for, and are we going to deliver to it. But I think the question on sort of disciplines more generally, I mean, Ali threw a grenade in on getting rid of the Department for Transport. For me, the absolute dominance of the individual psychological model and the individual economic model, they've got strengths in helping to explain why we make certain choices, but they've paralyzed us in terms of thinking about social change. Social change can't just be defined by looking at what happens with individuals. I've worked with sociologists, and it's been one of the most interesting kind of mind-opening exercises, on car sharing. Like the Department for Transport would ask individuals, what's your attitude to car sharing? Sociologists would say, well, let's go and look at how car sharing happens. It's already happening. How, what are the conditions that enable that to happen, and how could we create more of them? And they just think about the world in a different way. So I don't think we need to seek consensus. You don't want to mash those things up, but we just need to be more open to perspectives, because I find it really hard to see how we're going to engender the kind of scale of social change that we're thinking about, dealing with prices and preferences. Actually, it doesn't matter whether you want to do it or not. Like, you can't get to 100% carbon reduction in the time that we're thinking about by asking people whether they, is that nice enough for you? Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Nicola, anything to add to that one?
Well, it's interesting because when I first started my career, things were a little bit more integrated. So I came in as a land use planner with a sort of specialism in transport, and we had an integrated department for environment, transport and the regions briefly. And we seem to have moved back from that. That was obviously quite a challenging model to maintain, but it would be interesting to speculate whether we would be in a different place now if we'd continued to develop policies in that more integrated way. I think that relationship between land use and transport for me continues to be really, really important, and is an area where we need to get much better at developing joined up approaches. And then if you bring in digital connectivity to that as well, and that sort of triple access model that Glenn talks about, I think that's where we need to be. That's where we need to be heading. I think the other thing which kind of gives me hope with the younger generation is that a lot of this is going to be less about the evidence. Actually, we've been really, I think, as a profession, we're very focused on producing, you know, the best quality evidence to make the case. But actually, it's about engagement. It's about communicating with politicians in a language which they can really relate to, and it's not about, you know, traffic models and you know, spreadsheets and providing what we think is really sort of robust evidence. It's about selling much more of a vision. And certainly a lot of the young professionals that I work with, I think, are really, really good communicators. So I think building on those strengths and their ability to communicate with politicians, to communities, I think will be the key to achieving some of the things we want to achieve.
Okay, thanks for that, Nicola. I suppose this kind of links quite well to one of the other questions that popped up about what the level of disruption has truly been over the past 20 years. You know, we talk about things continuing as they are, but I suppose for young professionals to get inspired, are there any kind of examples of anything that you think's happened in the past 20 years that has genuinely changed the way that you know, transport operates, and, you know, something that could be potentially taken further? Shall I start with Greg on that one?
Thanks, Ed. We did a research project about eight years ago now. It was called Disruption, and we had a bit of trouble getting it funded because people said, well, what if there aren't any of these disruptions? And our idea was to learn about how people adapted in times of disruption. And we did get the funding. We then had trouble getting it published because our idea was that actually, if you look at how people behave, it just shows how much more adaptability there is in the population. So these are they're difficult, but they tell you about where the opportunities might be to adapt, and that was almost impossible to get published because people didn't believe that behavior change on the back of disruptions was a sensible thing to happen. So I think we've failed to kind of grasp the fact that actually, you know, that for all sorts of different reasons, change is ongoing. And actually, we need to build this kind of flexibility and understanding. I feel that's a real area of knowledge that could be developed. We need to be better at being flexible and responding to these sorts of things. There's no such thing as business as usual. You can't unexperience a pandemic and then go back to the way things were. The question is, how do we understand how to move forward? And I think that's the bit. I mean, I'm following some of the questions in the chat. I think that's the really difficult bit. You know, how do we understand how activities and society is going to change as a result of this? And then what's the role of transport in this post-COVID world? So I don't have any answers to that, but it's a really important question, and I think a really important area for the profession to be thinking about, not just because we're in a pandemic now, but because these things are not, you know, it's COVID this year, but, you know, global financial crisis a decade ago, that's probably why we didn't pay any attention to climate emissions. Yeah,
and I suppose building on that point, I mean, the one topic that's obviously coming up again and again in this conversation is about decarbonisation. And I think some of our, you know, emerging career professionals panel has talked about the need for activism in addition to everything else that's been going on there. But what I'm wondering here is, you know, whether there's a particular approach that could be more effective than others in engendering the sort of change that we want. I don't know whether you know, Claire or Dan or Laura, you have an opinion on whether there's anything in particular that can make sure people do change their behaviours effectively, whether it's technology, whether it's behaviour change, or whether it is activism and making sure that people stick to the programme.
I'd say we need all three, and probably lots of other things as well. I think it's going to take, you know, a plethora of things to really get that movement shifting. And I think the technology is important, and I think it kind of comes back to some of the things Greg was saying about disruption. Is you know, we've all changed how we're working, and what do we want to keep out of this, and how do we translate that into living more sustainable, decarbonised lifestyles as well. And I think it's thinking about the balance of those things. One thing that also occurred to me when we were going back a few conversations, but when we were talking about sharing and car sharing, Greg was saying that car sharing happens, how does it happen? I think we also need to think outside of our sector and our box. So I always come back to thinking about how people are quite willing to couch surf or use Airbnb and share their homes in that way, which to me almost feels like a bigger leap than sharing your car. And I think sometimes we need to think about how those practices happen outside of transport, what makes that okay, and can we bring some of those things into how we use our transport system. And I think it's, particularly thinking about that in sharing, but I'm sure there's other examples of behaviour change that we could think about outside of transport and how we could take some of that learning and apply it to sustainable transport as well.
Might be a good point to bring Ali into the conversation as someone who is the founder and CEO of a sharing company. Is there anything that you've drawn upon from outside the industry that's helped you push forward your company?
All the time. You don't look for rapid advances in the transport sector normally, although there have been. I mean, when you look at like Uber coming in, Uber's secret wasn't anything really to transport. They just asked what people wanted to do and then built their model as and when there's sufficient demand, they'd go into a new city based on the demand that was there. Airbnb is a good example. Their whole site was based around brand, around customer engagement, around giving people what they want at an affordable price. And they have shown what is possible. And what's amazing about COVID is it has shown that all the models were wrong. That like no one would have imagined we'd be sitting here all from different places, not all in one place, having an event that can be streamed around the world because of COVID. So we don't need to be in the office. We don't need to be traveling the way we're doing. And that hasn't come through from transport. That's come from something like from a pandemic. So we need as an industry to be looking out there to see what is happening. But the challenge with transport mostly is there's so much money in it, and there's so much people are very protective over their areas. We don't welcome disruption. Disruption can lose you your job. If you're at a council and you're disruptive, you're going to lose your job. If you're a consultancy saying there's a cheaper way to do this, you're like, hang on, that's where our money comes from. So it is a really odd industry. The energy sector somehow managed to, maybe because it's a few big players and they're competitive, they managed to get their goals right and almost work together to reduce emissions. Transport's almost gone the other way. We protect the wrong things here. You look at right now with COVID, the amount of money that's been spent on subsidising buses. I read something like £2 billion on subsidising public transport. Imagine if that had been spent on, I don't know, putting in cycleways or in promoting shared transport or doing something else. We've spent that money on propping up an industry, some of it rightly, but I think we just don't think laterally enough in the sector. So we need to look at other sectors, work out what they're doing and learn from them to advance quickly, because we haven't got much time on this.
Thanks for that, Ali. I think just picking up on this sort of energy and activism point, Glenn's just made the point here about there's a risk that if you portray yourself as an activist, and I think some people have pointed out that younger professionals are more willing and able, controversially, to take that kind of front foot on it, whether there's a potential reputational risk to the individual for responding in that way. I don't know whether Daniel or Laura, whether that's a view that you share, or whether as a younger professional you feel more confident to challenge some of the more established sort of societal and discursive norms out there.
Yeah, it's a bit of a challenge. I mean, I guess we as traditionally as transport planners, we don't necessarily have the right skills to do that. Yeah, I think a lot of our sort of skills are around the analysis of data, and it takes a particular person to be sort of in the detail of that kind of thing, and I guess maybe a different sort of person to be challenging leaders and really sort of being outgoing in terms of sort of leading the debate and challenging. So yeah, I guess I wonder, is that a bit of a skills gap in the transport industry, whether we need to sort of encourage that a bit more? amongst young professionals and others. But yeah, certainly something I struggle with, I think personally. And yeah, wouldn't know sort of how to go about it really, other than sort of becoming a keyboard warrior on Twitter, I guess. But yeah, I think definitely a gap in skills there.
Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Laura, just from that rural perspective that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I think there are always ways of doing things a bit more, a bit more ecologically, or reducing your emissions. But it is hard. And what I have found sometimes is that because it is more expensive, or it is not as readily available on short notice, those things get missed out, especially when you're talking about smaller local government budgets on transport, and that's something that is not right. It shouldn't be like that, but it is like that at the moment. I don't think there is enough incentive on maintaining the infrastructure as carbon neutral as you can right now.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Maybe a good point to pass over to Nicola next, just because I think you're on the coalface, as it were, in terms of articulating, stakeholder feedback, activism, views from a variety of people into something that is, policy based, and in theory is, grounded in changing the way that a political and an administrative organization works. So I don't know whether there's any lessons you can sort of impart on us in terms of what works best in making and engineering that change.
I think that this continues to be a real challenge, particularly in a sort of big area where you're trying to engage with, in Greater Manchester case, 2.7 million people with a huge range of diverse backgrounds and perspectives. So engagement and bringing people together is massively challenging. And again, I think this is where new thinking is required, and perhaps new uses of technology to engage people in different ways. Because we so often see these really polarized debates, and in some ways that's kind of getting worse with social media, that people tend to live in these kind of echo chambers where they just communicate with people who think the same as they do. So how can we bring together diverse perspectives and try to build stronger consensus around what our vision is for the future of places and for the future of transport, without necessarily focusing on solutions, but what kind of places do people want to live in? And I think if we sort of had some of those more open conversations, then you'd probably find there's more consensus than there necessarily appears on the surface, when you tend to get kind of focused on different modes competing against each other, whereas the solutions tend to be much more blended and nuanced than that. So we've tried a variety of different ways of doing that, and with sort of greater or lesser success, I would say, but using kind of different platforms to engage local residents. Use platforms like Commonplace, for example, to engage people on emergency active travel measures in their local areas. And there are lots more kind of technology-based solutions like that, which can help to engage people. But I think it's still really difficult to get to that kind of silent majority. So again, that might be an area perhaps that some of the young professionals might want to explore, about how we can use technology to engage with a more diverse range of people within our communities.
Thanks for that, Nicola. And yeah, it's worth pointing out, again, putting in a bit of a plug for the Future Transport Visions group, but we're not just looking for research papers here. If there is a particular idea, prototype, app that you're looking to develop and turn into something practical, the funding is available to support that, in addition to the more sort of day-to-day research activities that you might want to undertake. So looking across some of the points that have been made, and looking across some of the commonalities and differences across the two panels, it seems we're all united in the view that decarbonisation is key. I'd like to pick up actually on a point that Claire made about the role of freight in that decarbonisation debate, because I believe there was a paper published by the Transport Visions Network that focused on freight. So just zeroing in on that a little bit, Greg, you might be best placed to offer a view on that to begin with. How has the world of freight really changed in the past 20 years? You know, has the paper you produced as part of the Transport Visions Network, you know, made some points that are relevant today, or have things moved along so quickly in terms of e-commerce that we really need to have a rethink in that sort of area?
I think I'd quit the band by then, so there's not a report that I'm particularly familiar with, but I think so, you know, hands up freight is one of the areas that gets left out of like most transport planning curricula, you know, or it's a niche module rather than a mainstream consideration. And I think Claire's right to say it's not just like home shopping, but like the home as a hub, and houses being serviced places where lots of things happen now, I think is increasingly the case. And you know, if we're going to be working from home more, we have to anticipate that to be you know, potentially significant continuation and shift, and a you know, a shift to where things are happening in our towns and cities. So I mean, I think you could order books on Amazon at the time that we were running the network, and it was frowned upon because you're obviously putting your local bookstore out of business. But you know, there's no way that we'd foreseen it was going to be 17-20% of the market. I think there were, you know, the discussions about the problems of home deliveries for supermarkets were there, and that hasn't really kicked off. But I think the whole e-commerce thing's been a miss for us. Okay.
I was going to cross over now to some of the questions that our viewers on YouTube have put together. I feel like one of these YouTubers now, trying to look through these comments and seeing how to respond to them. The first one that's come through is actually quite an interesting point that is slightly different to what we've been talking about so far, and it's from Paul Thurman. And it's just regarding how the panel feel the current pandemic will impact the future employability opportunities and training of young professionals willing to get involved in the transport industry. So I don't know whether one of our panel of younger professionals wants to chip in on that, and whether, I think Claire's just put her hand up there.
Yeah, I think it's still a bit of an unknown at the moment, but I think the challenge comes with that sort of building the networks, getting the training, that early career stuff that's a lot about networking and getting to know your colleagues. And I think that will be a challenging thing to replicate in the digital world. And actually, things like having these networks of young professionals and groups where you can get to know each other and work together potentially are even more valuable in this world where we live in now. So yeah, I think it's still a bit unknown at the moment, but I think it is challenging. And I think there's also the questions around whether it's more challenging to have appropriate work environment at home for younger people, particularly if you're in a house share and that kind of thing, which is something that I think, you know, probably quite a lot of people are grappling with at the moment.
Yeah, a lot of competition for the Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Ali, I mean, you mentioned taking on, you know, young professionals in your work. Is there anything that you wanted to kind of feed into that from the skills side of things?
Yeah, I mean, we took on one the week before lockdown and one the week after, and they've both been brilliant. But I guess it's right now, I can see it's a real challenge, and it's a challenge because trying to get on the radar of employers and to share your skill set and show that you're capable is hard. I think if you're someone who's naturally good online, you build up your LinkedIn profile, you're proactive on that, reaching out, sending personalized messages to people, making connections, following forums, being part of that conversation, you're probably going to fly. I think if you're not on there, I can see it will be a challenge. We're now thinking with our next few recruits, can we train people properly without them being in the office for some of the skills we need now around tech and that side? And it is a big discussion. Do we pay more and take on someone with more experience, or do we try and train someone younger? And it's I'd say it's harder now than it has been. So if I was a young career professional going into the market now, I would just make sure I'm doing everything to join these forums, to be part of the conversation, to see what people are talking about, see what's relevant, and take part in the conversation, because otherwise I can see it will be a challenge for you.
Thank you, Ali. Does anyone else want to add anything to that comment about skills in the industry? Yes, Greg?
I just say, look at where things are going next. I think it could be a difficult year or two, but the decarbonisation challenge, there's going to be a lot of funding required. There's a whole systemic change to the way we power our vehicles, the way we design our networks. There's all the stuff that was raised about, online. That there's a whole set of opportunities there that might look quite different to the ones that we might have imagined 20 years ago. So I guess my suggestion would be think ahead about where you want to place yourself for the next 20 years. We kind of know what sorts of things are going to be coming down the track, and we haven't got those skills right now.
Yeah, and I guess just to add to that, Greg, is that, it's possibly easier to acquire those sorts of skills in this sort of digital age, all sorts of webinars and networking opportunities, and, even free courses from universities and different things that, can really help upskill and, get ahead of that change. And, I think that's possibly easier to do in this age.
I think
Okay,
employers are also going to, we need to learn from what happened after the last recession, where we lost at least 2 or 3 years worth probably of transport planners, so that either leaving jobs or not coming into the profession at all. And I think that legacy is still with us today to a certain extent. So it's going to be difficult because resources are going to be stretched, but somehow we need to find a way to continue to bring new people into the profession, to give them a range of opportunities. It might be more sort of learning on the job rather than formal training, certainly in the next couple of years. But I think we're going to have to find ways to invest in those people, because as Greg says, there's no shortage of really big transport challenges ahead of us, recovering from the pandemic, tackling the climate emergency. So we need those bright young things coming into the profession, definitely.
I suppose just there's a number of points in the comments box about the COVID-19 pandemic, and I suppose the debate there is drawn between is it just a flash of the pan and will everything return back to the way it was, or is it something that is actually going to be a catalyst for change? So I think it was a point that was picked up by a few of our panelists in terms of making sure that it's an opportunity to engender that change. But I suppose we're thinking about research projects that people might want to pick up on. How much do we think that the pandemic should play a part in any sort of emerging research, or should we be basing our emerging thinking on what things were like before? Ali?
I mean, our focus is the world of basically around commuting. And I think the workplace is one area that has changed forever, particularly office spaces. All of our clients, we've got 700 corporate clients. They're all looking at changing how their staff travel to work flexibly or not coming back at all. Lots of shutting offices, moving offices, downsizing. So I can see that is going to fundamentally change. Also around business travel, people have realized you don't need to hop on a plane to go to America for business trips anymore. The idea of going off on a jolly business trip, that's all gone too. I can see the flight sector for business miles never going back to how it was before, because it just didn't make sense. It wasn't an efficient use of time or of carbon. But for other modes of transport, I'm not so sure that it's such a rosy picture. We're seeing, when we're based in Norwich, we're seeing traffic levels up to what they were pre-COVID now already, even though most of the offices are shut. People are switching how they're traveling, commuting to doing other modes. I'm not sure what they're doing. So it's a major concern. I think we all loved going out, walking and cycling more when it was real lockdown, and we could see how wonderful the environment was, the roads were. It was an incredible time. So I'm nervous about it going back, but I'm hopeful, particularly around workspaces, that they will never go back to how they were, and we've just got to try and make that more the case in other kind of types of travel too.
Just to bring maybe Claire into the conversation, as your job is a day-to-day researcher, I mean, to what extent are you focusing on the impact of COVID and versus, you know, the way things were in looking ahead?
Yeah, I think, I mean, we are thinking about it a lot, and I think it's still very uncertain, and I think there's a lot of questions about how we use and plan our cities and towns as well, because we've had a model where we, you know, travel into city centres to work, eat, go out, shop, and I think a lot of people have kind of started using their local centres a bit more and those kind of things. And I think, you know, kind of over the summer we saw a big push to get people back into offices in the city centres, so that city centres would be revitalised and we'd keep all our prats. And obviously we've kind of reversed back from that now. But equally, over the last few years, we've kind of had a lot of stuff about revitalising local high streets and local centres. And part of me wonders which of those it is that we want, because maybe we can have it all, but I'm not so sure. So I think maybe we have to think about what we really want and what we want to go back to. And maybe that's a project in itself, is kind of understanding what we want to go back to and what we don't, and how that influences our planning and our cities and our transport.
Thanks, Claire. I mean, I think that echoes a point that Gustav has just posted on the comments board, is in terms of what the new normal looks like. Greg, I see you've unmuted yourself if you want to contribute to that point.
Yeah, I think and one of the other points in the chat from Steve Gooding, you know, actually the change in the peak it's fundamental to the economics of public transport. That's how it pays for itself, to the extent that it does pay for itself, that big morning commute. And if we're not going back to that, then we've really got to rethink what service patterns are there for and how they're going to be paid for. So I think, you know, that is all to shake out. And just reflecting on Ali's point, I've been like musing over this. Why is road traffic back to 85% or whatever of where it was before? I think that the thing is, commutes, it's 20% of trips. It just happens to be the bit that we've focused on most, because that's where we see the problem in the network. But it's not as important to total travel. And I think, if anything, that's what the pandemic is telling us. We've got to pay attention to the whole range of different things that people do, and not just the morning commute to solve congestion, which we never did anyway.
Yeah. Dan, were you going to come in just before Greg there?
Yeah, I think just opportunities sort of for cities and local governments to be bold, really. They can sit around sort of thinking, what's this new normal, what's this change going to look like, or they can sort of help shape that vision and shape that to improve the sort of improve the city for people rather than traffic. And I think we've seen that sort of from a lot of cities already. But yeah, I guess the question is how to maintain that momentum. Can it still be justified, if there's not such a need for social distancing and things? But I think cities that are bold and help to shape that change are sort of the ones that are going to be good places to live in and places to visit and deliver economic growth and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that, Ed, in terms of having that clarity of vision. Your pathway to that vision may need to be adjusted. And again, the need for places to be flexible and adaptable and responding to social and economic change is really crucial. But maintaining that clarity of vision is absolutely crucial. And we need to work, again, much more across different sectors within the places that we're planning for. To be having those much more joined up conversations about the relationship between transport, land use planning, other areas of policy making, so that we can say, well, collectively, this is what we're moving towards, and the way we deliver that may need to flex over time, but that we don't have to be paralysed by that uncertainty. And I think that's a much more kind of compelling kind of environment to be working in than saying, oh my God, we have no idea what's going to happen in 2 years' time, so we can't possibly make any decisions in the near term.
just noticed there's a bit of chatter going on between Glenn and Paul about more than one new normal. I think it's causing a bit of consternation in there. Claire, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, well, it was actually on that and just thinking about that new normal. But what I was thinking is that if we can design our cities to be sustainable and livable and resilient and prioritize sort of active travel and local lifestyles and this kind of 15-minute neighborhood type model, then perhaps we can be resilient to what uncertainty faces us. And it is kind of shifting away from that thinking around planning around the morning commute and that kind of thing. But yeah, that was kind of my thought. Perhaps we can deliver more resilient cities that can weather these challenges.
And I suppose as well as resilient cities, we could think about resilient towns and villages as well. And that goes to the point that Laura made about older people, rural mobility and that sort of thing. I suppose from your perspective, Laura, is what sort of places do you think people want in that rural setting?
Well, what I was thinking is I can't see a problem where I can't see working from home as being a challenge. I think there are industries where obviously you do have to go somewhere to do your work, but if all you need is a laptop, what is the need of having a big shiny office and getting the people in there every morning and out every evening when there's no need for it? There is also there's always a lot around well, if I have to work here, then I have to live here, which is so many miles away. If you eliminate that, then you decentralize your cities and your big towns. You potentially start going back to how it was 40 years ago with the smaller urban centers where people used to live in sort of more communities. And I think we maybe that may happen in the future. I don't. It's not the death of cities, but I don't think moving into a city is as key as it would have been a few years ago to find a job, to work for a big company, to do all these things where your parents, grandparents, family, older people would pushing you to do.
Okay, thanks for that, Laura. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I know we're clocking down towards 2 o'clock. So I thought I'd round off with quite a blue sky question. Blue sky behind me. Just about thinking to 2040, really, and what challenges we think we'll be facing across the piece in another 20 years' time. Obviously, the Transport Visions Network panel have pointed out a few things that haven't changed, a few things that they didn't anticipate that took place between 2000 and 2020. But thinking ahead to 2040, we've talked about smaller communities, we've talked about a decarbonised future, we've talked about a technological future, but what areas do our young professionals think they'll be taking on when they're in their 40s and 50s? I'll start with Claire on that one.
I'll try and do blue. Well, I'll try to do grey of my grey thought first. I hope that we won't be dealing with a future where we're trying to manage extreme climate impacts, and that we'll be living in a world of decarbonised transport and and those really localised lifestyles and neighbourhoods and I would say that I think that offices and workplaces will have a place in the future. Personally, I really miss that, like being able to work closely with colleagues on a regular basis. And I think working from home is here to stay. And I imagine that 2040 would look like a real blend of those two things as well.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Laura, any thoughts?
I can't even start imagining, to be honest. There is so many things that we can do before another 20-30 years time that I can't and seeing how much the pandemic has disrupted everything that we thought was sort of set in stone and going into one direction. I can't even start to imagine what could come and what sort of challenges we will be imagining, because there's so many open paths at the moment. There's so many things that could happen.
Laura acknowledging the uncertainty cubed principle there, I think. Daniel, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I think 2040, hopefully we're sort of well on our way to this net zero, if not already there, hopefully. But yeah, I guess sort of what I've learned from today and sort of looking over the network sort of thoughts from 20 years ago is that probably not a lot's going to change. You know, we've probably got in our head, you know, well, we'll be flying around in vehicles and using drones to get about, etc. But you know, I bet yeah, perhaps with the exception of autonomous vehicles and things, I bet the transport system looks probably quite similar to today. And yeah, I guess we'll probably be having a similar discussion perhaps. But yeah, hopefully we're able to get together and sort of give ourselves a pat on the back, having achieved our sort of are well on our way to this sort of net zero.
Okay, switching attention then to the Transport Visions Network, you've already seen the changes over one set of 20 years. So looking ahead to the next 20, do you see there being any fundamental changes in the way that we'll be approaching transport research, or will we be reconvening here in 2040 talking about mode shift once again? I might start with Nicola.
Well, I'm generally a glass half full person, so I'll try and be as optimistic as I can about the future. I mean, I hope that the way we think about transport is much more around this sort of vision-led approach, and much less around our sort of traditional predict and provide. It seems to be taking a long time to kind of move into that paradigm, but I'm hoping that's just kind of standard practice, and that we're much more willing to embrace uncertainty, and that we've got, you know, a clear vision about the sorts of places we want to live and spend time in. I do think urban areas will still be important. I think the shape of urban areas may well change, but I think they'll still be fundamentally important, and places where people again want to live and work. And I think maybe the role of, you know, somewhere like Greater Manchester, which has got a very dominant city centre, but also has these town centres, that they are thriving places again, and people want to live close to a town centre. They may still commute into the city centre maybe 2 days, 3 days a week, and that we've still got thriving public transport system, but people are doing a lot of their day-to-day stuff close to home, around these more kind of local neighbourhood type areas. So I am optimistic for the future, but I think we've got a huge number of challenges ahead of us, and we really need to kind of galvanise action, and make really rapid progress, not over that 20-year period, but over the next 5-10 years. That's where we need to see some really dramatic changes in thinking, but also in what we actually deliver over these next few years.
Okay, thanks, Nicola. Ali, are you a glass half full or a glass half empty person?
When the question was asked, I just wrote down, I hope we've still got the choice. But if I'm being realistic, I don't think we've got a choice now. When in 2000 we were looking at this, there were so many choices, ideas, opportunities. I think we have to wake up and realise that we don't have a choice now. We've got to set ourselves these goals. We can't just think about them. We've got to make them happen. And we've got to all start acting on that vision right now. We can't talk about it for another 20 years. Transport will not be the same in 20 years' time. Either we'll have solved this, or we'll be drowning or burning, or it's going to be all. If we don't do this, we're never going to forgive ourselves. So we've got to get on with it right now. So I hope to God we're not sat here in 20 years' time, because, well, I won't be. I don't know what I'll be doing, but I will either be very cross or just sitting in my local community chatting to my neighbours once again, which is a future that I definitely want to be heading towards, rather than coming. Well, we've got to sort this. Let's get on and sort it.
Okay, thanks. Greg, any final thoughts?
Really disappointed that I don't know if a bus pass is still going to exist and whether I'll still be eligible for one. I think the young professionals really dodged that particular question. Yeah, I think I completely agree. Actually, now is not the time. I mean, we do need the kind of vision that Nicola owns in Greater Manchester to communicate with people, but actually it's not about 2040, it's about 2020, 2021, 2022. If we don't if we don't change things now, then we will shift to the kind of world that Claire was talking about, which is much more adaptation, and the one that, you know, we'll look back on our careers and say, you know, we didn't do what we should have done. And if we do that, then what would you'd be talking about in 2040? I don't know, but degrowth of traffic and massive social innovation. I think there's still a lot of potential in society to innovate, to solve these problems, if we can find ways of taking people with us. So, you know, I think that's crucial for the next 2, 3, 4 years. We've got to change the politics of this. I don't think we're ready to take radical steps at the moment, and we have to be.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that, Greg, and thank you to all 6 of our panelists for taking the time out of their lunch and their day to take part in today's discussion. I hope everyone watching this has found it useful, informative, inspirational, or indeed a call to action. You know, the opportunity is there for you to influence the transport debate, and hopefully in its own small way, the Future Transport Visions group can help to facilitate that. So remember, if you do wish to submit an idea to FTVG, you can go to ftvg.co.uk, click on the expression of interest form and fill out your idea. And the initiative will then hopefully pair you up with a group of like-minded people that can help to take that idea forward. And just before I hand over to Brogan, I'd just like to thank Brogan for all her help in putting this event together, wrangling the technology, passing on all of your comments. I'm sorry we didn't get around to answering every single one of them, but I think on that note, I'd like to pass back to Brogan. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Thanks, panelists. It was a great discussion, and thanks to everyone on YouTube that submitted questions. I thought there were some good ideas coming out of there. But just to say, we'll have another fireside chat soon, so stay tuned. And on that note, we'll say goodbye. Bye.